It is funny writing a memoir. Sometimes I'll be traveling around and someone will say, how are you doing with the insomnia? Still taking Ambien? And I'll be like, how do you know that? And it's like, oh yeah, I wrote a memoir. But I also, as I'm talking, as your mind will probably be wandering, as it does with me when I'm listening to anyone talk, I would really love in conversation to hear about titles, about books that have been very meaningful to you in your life and life's journey, especially ones that have helped you or people you love through passages in life. Now, it's funny being here amidst so many books and authors and book lovers. I want to start with a thought that really just came to me recently, and it's this. People used to ask me all the time, what do you think the greatest gift in the world is? And I had an answer that I would say without hesitation. I would say the greatest gift in the world is a book. But I actually don't believe that anymore. I believe a book is the second greatest gift in the world. I believe the greatest gift in the world is the conversation you have about a book. The kind of conversation where you learn something from someone and they learn something from you, and maybe you started in different places, and in the end of the day, you find you're really on the same page. And one of the things to me that makes an event like this so very magical is that even though books are very private, we usually read them alone, and after we've read them, and no matter what format we've read them, they exist inside our head. That doesn't mean that we don't need public spaces to come together and talk about books and meet each other and engage over books. So I think a festival like this is both something quite simple, a lovely way to get together, but also something quite revolutionary, which is bringing people together over books and conversation about books. Let me tell you a little bit about the book that I wrote. Now, as some of you may know, the End of Your Life Book Club is about the books I read with my mother when she was dying of pancreatic cancer. But I also like to think it's about something more than that. I like to think it's about how books tell us what we need to do in our lives and in the world. First, let me give you some background on the book. In October 2007, my mother, who was then 73 years old, was diagnosed with stage 4B pancreatic cancer. This is the most lethal kind of cancer there is, and very frequently people don't live any longer than 3 to 6 months. But my family was incredibly lucky, and my mother lived for almost 2 years. And as you can imagine, during that time, our lives became very much filled with doctor's visits, with tests, and my mother had chemo every 2 weeks for those 2 years. So my brother, my sister, my father, and I, and lots of mom's friends took turns accompanying her to her various appointments. And as it happened, given my schedule and various other things, I very frequently went with her to chemo. And during those times, we'd have anywhere from 1 to 7 hours together. We did what we'd done all our lives, which is we talked about books. And very quickly, it occurred to me that we'd formed a very peculiar little book club, one with only 2 members, a mother and a son. Now, I have to tell you, when I first had this realization, I said to my mother, Mom, if we keep meeting like this, it's kind of like a book club. And my mother's reaction was instant. She said, Sweetie, don't be silly. It can't possibly be a book club. And I said, really, Mom, why not? And she said, because there's no food. So I said, okay, we will have the world's only foodless book club. And we were off to the races. So the book is about the conversations I had with my mother. It's about what I learned from her and what we both learned from the books we read. And it was a very eclectic bunch of books. It ranged from things like Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner. By the way, who's read Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner? What do you think? Trouble getting into it. Oh, I had trouble getting into Crossing to Safety too. And I joke in the book that if there were frequent flyer programs for books, my copy of Crossing to Safety would have earned like a first-class ticket to Tokyo, because I took it with me everywhere and could never read it. And people, I used to say, what's your favorite book? And they would say Crossing to Safety. And I did something I'm very embarrassed about, which is I would fib. I'd be like, oh, yeah, Crossing to Safety. I loved it. Nuts about the book. Love Stegner. Great. Because I just got irritated hearing people tell me how great it was so many times. But when you're sitting there with your mother and she's having chemo and she said, I've read Crossing to Safety and I loved it. Have you read it? Well, you don't fib to your mother. So that was the first book we read in our book club, and I fell head over heels in love with it. I finally persevered. I urge you to do the same. And if my whole book tour does nothing but get people to persevere and make it through Crossing to Safety, I swear my work is done. Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner. I am calling the library next week. If there's a single copy left on the shelves, I will be very disappointed. But what I want to mention is, we didn't decide to sort of read books in an artificial or stunt-like way. It wasn't like, oh, mom only has a limited amount of time left, so we're going to read capital G great books. We're going to read the Loeb Classical Library. No. Reading was a joy for us, and we wanted the joy to continue the way it always had. So we read the way normal people do. We read books on our bookshelf, books on our night table. We read books that we found in great bookstores and in the library. We read books where we read a good review. And my mother was incredibly thrifty. So if you gave her a book, no matter what it was, she would read it. So we read every book anyone gave my mother. And so this meant we read Marilyn Robinson and Jhumpa Lahiri. We read P.G. Wodehouse. We read Thomas Mann. We read poetry by people like Mary Oliver. We read books like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson. We read nonfiction books like David Halberstam's magnificent book, The Coldest Winter, about the Korean War.